Evelyn always knew she was different, but different in the Crescent Moon Pack meant disposable. Twice, the annual mating ceremony left her shattered and ridiculed. Now, as she walks toward the ancient stone altar for the third time, the air thickens with cold judgment, and a devastatingly handsome Beta steps forward. His words of rejection are sharp, public, and meant to destroy her completely. But Evie's unique scent, dismissed as weak by common wolves, is noticed by the only figure who truly matters. The legendary Lycan king, Duncan Drogo, an alpha stronger than other alphas, descends. He ignores the alphas and betas, striding directly to the rejected Omega. In a move that shocks the werewolf world, he claims her. "Your scent is not meant for a simple wolf," he declares. "It is meant for a king." But the cord is deadly, and the beta who threw her away now vows to destroy her. Chapter 1. The Laughingstock's Hope. The scent of damp earth and the sharp tang of pack anxiety always made Evelyn Stone's stomach clench. Today, it threatened to make her sick. The morning sun, barely cresting the ridge of the Crescent Moon Pack's territory, offered no warmth. It only served to illuminate the ceremonial grounds where she would, for the third and final time, be offered up for judgment. She tugged at the frayed hem of her simple, beige tunic. It was the best she had, clean and mended. But she knew it was laughable compared to the fine silks and embossed leathers the other unmated females would be wearing. She was Evie, the pack's laughingstock, the quiet Omega, the orphan shadow who cleaned the pack house messes, ate last, and spoke only when spoken to. From her tiny attic room, she watched the pack members gathering below. A small, bitter sound escaped her. Hope was a dangerous, stupid thing, and yet a tiny, flickering ember of it refused to die. The memory of the first rejection was a raw, puckered scar. She had been 18, naive, and terrified. Silas, the pack alpha's son, had sniffed the air around her, his handsome face twisting into a sneer. "Her?" he'd announced, loud enough for the entire assembly to hear. "She's a barren Omega, a pack disgrace. I reject her." The second time, just last year, had been worse. A visiting beta from the River Pack, a man with kind eyes, had approached. He'd studied her, and for a heart-stopping moment, Evie thought he saw something more. Then he'd shaken his head with a sigh of pity. "She is not strong enough. I need a female who can bear strong sons, not this." His dismissive wave had encompassed all of her. Too thin, too quiet, too weak. Now, at 21, she was facing her third and final ceremony. After today, if she was not claimed, she would be officially relegated. She would be assigned permanent menial labor, barred from all future pack gatherings, and left to fade into complete, crushing invisibility. The tiny spark of hope she held wasn't for a grand love, or even a kind mate. It was simply the hope to belong, to have the torment and the mockery finally end. Evie squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she gripped the worn wooden windowsill. She could already hear the giggles of the other girls as they passed her door. "Evie's up again," one of them whispered, followed by a cruel laugh. Why does she even bother? She bothered because of a voice softer than the jeers, but more persistent. "You are special, Evie. You are destined for greatness." Her grandmother, Catherine. The memory of her was the only warmth Evie had ever known. Catherine, who had found her at 5 years old, a lone survivor of the rogue attack that had stolen her parents. Catherine, who had taught her herbs and letters, and who, with her dying breath, had held Evie's face and repeated that one impossible promise. Greatness. What a joke. Evie felt anything but great. She was an Omega, triply shamed, with no family, no status, and a scent so bland it registered as little more than prey to the dominant wolves around her. A sharp, demanding rap on her attic door shattered her thoughts. "Evie, get down here! The Alpha demands all unmated females assemble. Now!" It was Maris, the pack's head Omega, her voice as sharp as broken glass. Evie took one last shuddering breath. She pressed her palm against the small, smooth locket Catherine had given her, hidden beneath her tunic. The metal was cold against her clammy skin. Destined for greatness. The words felt like a lie, a cruel fairy tale. But they were all she had. Straightening her spine, she pulled her flimsy shield of dignity around her. She opened the door to Maris's impatient glare and stepped out, beginning the long, silent walk down to the ceremonial grounds, where her final humiliation awaited. Chapter 2. The Icy Watcher. Evie's walk to the ceremonial grounds was a familiar, agonizing ritual. She kept her eyes on the cracked, dusty path, her thin shoulders hunched. She could feel the stares. They were as physical as prodding fingers, a mix of pity, disgust, and casual cruelty. A few feet to her left, she heard Alara and Seraphina, two pack females known for their sharp tongues, fail to lower their voices. "Honestly, can you imagine?" Alara whispered, the sound carrying easily in the tense morning air. "If no one wanted her the first 2 times, what's the point of this? She's just embarrassing the alpha." "She's embarrassing herself," Seraphina countered, her voice laced with the particular scorn reserved for those who dared to hope above their station. "A stunted Omega. My mother said she's probably barren. She should have just accepted her assignment at the kitchens last year." Evie's hand reflexively tightened on the locket beneath her tunic. Barren, stunted, flawed. The words were her daily bread. She took her place at the very back of the unmated females, a small beige shadow against the vibrant colors the other girls wore. But as she stood there, a new, unfamiliar tension coiled in the air. It was more than the usual ceremony nerves. This was a thick, oppressive blanket of fear. She lifted her head, her gaze drawn past the altar to the low rise overlooking the valley. A new structure stood there, stark and temporary. It was a viewing platform, high above the common ground, draped in banners of midnight black and burnished silver. She didn't recognize the insignia. A snarling, 3-headed wolf. Armed guards, clad in gleaming black armor that seemed to drink the morning light, stood utterly immobile at its 4 corners. They were not crescent moon warriors. A trembling whisper came from the girl beside her, one Evie barely knew. "Moon goddess, save us, it's true. He's here." "Who?" Evie whispered back, her voice raspy. "The king," the girl breathed, her eyes wide with a terror that was almost religious. "The Lycan king. Duncan Drogo." The name landed like a boulder in a still pond, the ripples of its impact silencing the entire assembly. The Lycan king. He was a figure of myth, a ghost story whispered by elders to frighten pups. An alpha of alphas, the ancient, immortal ruler of all werewolf kind, whose power was said to be absolute. Pack alphas were leaders, but the Lycan king was a force. Rumors claimed he hadn't attended a common pack ceremony in a century. His presence was not an honor, it was a judgment. Evie's heart, which had been hammering with shame, now seized with a new, colder dread. She risked a glance at the platform. She could see him now, a single, massive figure seated on a throne-like chair. He was a silhouette of stillness, an abyss of power. He made her own formidable alpha, who was currently clearing his throat and visibly sweating at the base of the altar, look like a nervous pup. The king's aura rolled down the hill like a physical frost, prickling her skin, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. He was watching. The ceremony began. Alpha Marcus's voice, usually a booming command, was thin and strained. "Welcome," he began, his eyes darting to the silent watcher. We are profoundly honored by the presence of our king." The king did not move. He did not nod. He simply watched, his stillness a screaming pressure. The names were called, one by one. The air was so thick, Evie felt she might suffocate. A female named Lyra was claimed by a beta from their own pack. The claiming was a brief, terrified nod. The beta didn't dare whoop or lift his new mate. He just scurried away with her, desperate to be out of the king's line of sight. Another female, Briar, was rejected. The visiting alpha simply shook his head, and Briar's sob was a thin, sharp sound in the heavy silence. She ran from the altar, her shame amplified 1,000 times by the royal audience. Evie's turn was coming. The dread was a living thing, clawing its way up her throat. She closed her eyes, her fingernails digging into her palms. "You are special, Evie. You are destined for greatness." The words sounded hollow now, a child's fantasy against the crushing reality of that icy, watchful presence. Then, the alpha's voice cracked, thick with his own embarrassment. He had reached the end of the list. He had reached her. Evelyn Stone. Chapter 3. The Third Rejection. A different kind of silence fell. It was not the respectful hush of anticipation or the stunned silence of the king's presence. It was a dead, heavy, humiliating pause. The entire Crescent Moon Pack knew her name, knew her story. This was the part of the ceremony where they had to endure their pack's collective shame. Evie could hear the low, cruel snickers from the warrior line. She felt the burning pity from the pack elders. It was all a performance, and she was the designated fool. "Evelyn Stone," Alpha Marcus repeated, his voice sharper this time, impatient, eager to get this final, mortifying duty over with. Her legs felt like stone. "Move. Just move. Get it over with." She forced one foot in front of the other, emerging from the relative anonymity of the back row. The walk to the raised wooden altar was 100 miles long. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Every eye in the valley was on her, 1,000 points of judgment. And above them all, she felt the cold, penetrating gaze from the hill. The king was watching. He was watching her, the pack's laughingstock, the barren Omega, in her final moment of abject failure. She stepped onto the platform and stood, her head bowed, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden planks. She waited for the inevitable dismissal, a simple, "No one," from her alpha, and she could run. But a figure stepped forward, her head snapped up in shock. Someone had actually moved. He was tall, not from her pack, with broad shoulders and a handsome, arrogant face. He wore the leathers of the Shadow Creek pack, their beta insignia displayed proudly on his chest. He radiated a supreme, unbothered confidence. "I am Caleb, beta of the Shadow Creek pack," he announced, his voice smooth and strong. Evie's heart gave a single, painful, treacherous lurch. Hope. He didn't know her. He wasn't part of her pack's history. He saw a female, not a story. He was looking at her with genuine curiosity, his eyes raking over her thin frame. He took a slow, assessing circle around her, like a buyer inspecting livestock. Evie stood frozen, barely breathing. "Maybe. Please, goddess, maybe." Caleb stopped directly in front of her. His confidence was absolute. He leaned in, his nose just inches from her throat, and took a deep, deliberate inhalation to catch her scent. Evie's scent was her deepest shame. It wasn't the warm, loamy, fertile scent of a healthy Omega. It was different, faint, almost undetectable to most, but with a strange, sharp undertone. A scent the pack healers had dismissed as stunted and wrong. Caleb's handsome face, which had been alight with curiosity, instantly contorted. He physically recoiled, pulling back as if he'd been struck. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust twisted his features. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous, for her ears only. He leaned in again, sniffing once more, and this time his expression hardened from disgust to outrage. His beta wolf instincts, screaming for a strong, earthy, submissive mate, were repulsed by her scent. It was alien. It was cold. To him, it was the smell of a fundamental flaw. He straightened to his full height, his face a mask of scorn. He wasn't just rejecting her, he was insulted. He didn't just look at her. He looked past her, to the crowd, to her alpha, and with a fatal, arrogant glance even up toward the king. He was performing. "I, Caleb, beta of the Shadow Creek Pack," he announced, his voice booming with theatrical indignation, "emphatically reject Evelyn Stone." A wave of blackness and dizziness crashed over Evie. The third time. It had happened. The laughter was already starting, a low ripple of mockery. But he wasn't done. He had to cement his own status, to show the visiting king that he was a wolf of standards. "The Crescent Moon Pack should be ashamed," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "To even offer such flawed goods at a sacred ceremony. She is an insult to the moon goddess, a wasting of our sacred traditions." The words flawed goods struck her harder than any physical blow. They echoed in the dead silence that followed his pronouncement. This was it. The final, indelible brand. She was worthless. She was nothing. The laughter that finally broke free, open and cruel, was the sound of her world, her hope, and her very soul cracking into 1,000 pieces. Chapter 4. The King's Roar. The world dissolved into a gray, humming void. The edges of Evie's vision tunneled, the sneering face of Caleb, the pitying looks, the open, cruel laughter. It all faded into a smear of noise and malice. Caleb, his duty as a wolf of standards complete, strutted off the altar. He was already preening, accepting a congratulatory backslap from a friend, as if he had just done the pack a great service by exposing their resident fraud. Alpha Marcus stared at the ground, his face purple with humiliation. Not for her, for his pack. It was over. Her grandmother's voice, her only shield for so many years, echoed in her mind. "You are destined for greatness." A single hot, bitter tear escaped her. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of betrayal. "You were wrong, grandmother," she thought, the words a silent scream in her hollowed-out chest. "You were wrong about everything. There is no greatness. There is only this." She was the laughingstock, the flawed goods, the triple-rejected Omega. Her body, moving on pure, primal instinct, finally obeyed the only command left. Flee. She had to escape. She had to get to the woods, to the dark, quiet anonymity of the trees, where she could crawl into a hole and simply stop. She could not bear to be looked at for one more second. She turned her back to the crowd, a small, hunched, broken thing. Her feet tangled, she stumbled, her shaky hands outstretched. She hadn't taken a single step. A sound ripped the world apart. It was not a sound she heard with her ears. It was a concussion, a physical column of sound and power that slammed into the valley, shaking the very bones of the earth. It was a devastating, primal, authoritative roar, a command so ancient and absolute that it vibrated in her teeth, in her marrow, in the deepest, most dormant part of her wolf. All other noise ceased. The laughter, the whispers, the wind in the pines, the beat of her own panicked heart. Everything was annihilated. The air crackled, thick with an oppressive, terrifying force that demanded, that compelled, obedience. Every wolf in the assembly, from Alpha Marcus to the lowest-ranking Omega, was instantly and instinctively forced into submission. Many, including her Alpha, dropped to their knees, their heads bowed to the dirt. The pack warriors, so proud and strong, now trembled, their hands frozen on weapons they would never dare to draw. A few of the weaker-willed wolves whimpered, their animal instincts taking over completely. Evie was frozen in place, her back still to the crowd. The roar hadn't just scared her, it had done something else. It had resonated with that flawed, silver-laced scent, awakening something deep inside her, a tiny, terrified vibration that answered the command. The silence that followed the roar was absolute. It was heavier, more profound than any sound she had ever heard. It was the silence of a world holding its breath. Then, a new sound. A single, heavy bootstep on the gravel of the hillside path. Slow, deliberate, inevitable. No one moved, no one breathed, All eyes, terrified, submissive, awestruck, lifted, not to Evie, but to the shadow descending from the royal box. The king was no longer watching. He was coming. Chapter 5. The Claim King. Duncan Drogo moved like a shadow given form, a living piece of the night detaching itself from the gloom of the royal box. He didn't just walk down the path, he consumed it, the very air seeming to part before him, recoiling from the sheer oppressive weight of his power. The crowd didn't just make way. They scrambled backward, tripping over themselves, a wave of silent panic rippling through the assembly, as if a physical, invisible force field was pushing them. His aura was a tangible thing, a biting, arctic cold that dropped the temperature of the valley by 10 degrees. He was not a myth. He was a terrifying, magnificent reality. He was dressed in dark, severe leathers that made no sound as he moved, his massive frame a study in brutal efficiency and contained power. As he drew closer, Evie could see his face. It was a mask of cold, chiseled granite, beautiful but utterly devoid of mercy. And his eyes, they were not the brown or gold of a wolf. They were a piercing, inhuman silver, glowing with an ancient, icy light that seemed to see everything, to judge everything. Evie stood paralyzed on the altar, a sacrifice left for a dragon. She couldn't run. She couldn't even breathe. The king's gaze was locked on her. He did not look at Alpha Marcus, who was bowed so low his forehead scraped the dust. He did not look at the fawning, terrified females who had mocked her. He walked a straight, unbothered line through the center of the assembly, his heavy boots silent on the packed earth until he stood at the base of the altar. He loomed over her, a mountain of dark, ancient power. His shadow fell over her, swallowing her whole. Evie trembled, waiting for the end. He would kill her. He would strike her down for being the flawed goods that had disrupted this sacred ceremony, for being the one to draw his ire. He tilted his head, his silver-eyed gaze analytical, intense. He was so close now she could smell him, the sharp, clean scent of cold mountain air, and something ancient, like millennia-old stone and dark, rich earth. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout. It was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the wood of the altar and up the soles of her feet. It was a sound meant for her, yet it carried to every corner of the silent valley. "The third rejection," he stated, his voice a calm, lethal current, "seals your freedom from a fate too weak to claim you." The words were so stunningly unexpected, Evie's blurred vision sharpened. She stared at him. He was still looking at her, and his silver eyes held no disgust, no pity. They held recognition. He took one slow, deliberate step up onto the altar, placing him on her level. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating. He leaned in, his gaze flickering to the pulse point on her neck, where her unique, silver-laced scent was strongest. A strange, dark expression crossed his features. "Your scent," he declared, his voice rising, projecting with cold, clear authority to every cowering wolf. "Your power is not meant for a simple pack wolf." His silver eyes lifted from her and deliberately sought out Caleb. He pinned the arrogant beta with a look of such profound, icy dismissal that Caleb physically flinched, a low, terrified whimper escaping his throat as his alpha posturing collapsed into primal fear. Then, the king's gaze returned to Evie. The center of the universe narrowed to the two of them, standing on the platform of her shame. He did not touch her. He did not have to. He simply held out one large, black-gloved hand, palm up. It was not a request. It was not an offer. It was a command. It is meant for a king.
Chapter 6. The Crown. You threw away. The world snapped back into focus for Caleb in a rush of hot, sour adrenaline. He was still standing, frozen, his hand half raised from the backslap he'd been giving his packmate. The king, the Lycan king, was walking away, and the little flawed Omega, Evelyn Stone was following him. She hadn't even looked back. She'd just gone. She'd put her small, trembling hand into the king's gloved one and had been led off the altar as if she were made of glass. The oppressive weight of the king's power lifted as his retinue disappeared over the ridge, and the valley erupted in a chaotic babble of terrified, awestruck whispers. Did you see his eyes? He just took her. What did he mean, meant for a king? Caleb felt a cold sweat on his neck. His wolf was whimpering, its tail tucked, utterly cowed by the display of primal authority. He, a beta, had been dismissed like a pup. He, who had just been performing his strength and standards for the assembly, had been made to look like an ignorant fool. Caleb? Man, are you okay? His friend Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder, and Caleb flinched. I'm fine, Caleb snarled, shoving the hand away. He was not fine. A burning, acidic humiliation was clawing its way up his throat, choking him. He had just publicly, emphatically, rejected flawed goods. And the alpha of alphas had, in turn, publicly, emphatically declared those goods a priceless treasure. This didn't just make Evie look special. It made him look blind, stupid, weak. By the goddess, Marcus breathed, his voice a low, mocking whistle. Caleb, you idiot. That scent. The king knew it. He knew what it was. And you threw her away. Another voice, a rival beta from his own pack, chimed in, his words dripping with false sympathy. Don't be too hard on him, Marcus. How could he know? Though I must say, Caleb, he said, a cruel grin spreading across his face. It's not every day you see a wolf throw away a crown. A crown. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. The laughter started then, low at first, then spreading among the visiting packs. They weren't just laughing at Evie anymore. They were laughing at him, the arrogant beta who had sneered at the king's fated queen. The one you rejected, his rival continued, savoring the moment, is now the Lycan queen. You just threw away a crown, Caleb. A crown. Humiliation was a fire. Rage was the fuel. It exploded in his chest, a violent, blistering inferno. He was Caleb, beta of the Shadow Creek pack. He was respected. He was strong. He would not be the laughingstock of the territories. He would not be the fool in this story. She's a fraud, Caleb growled, his voice low and shaking with fury. The other wolves quieted, sensing the dangerous shift in his demeanor. Caleb, Marcus started, looking nervous. She's a fraud, Caleb roared, his gaze sweeping the crowd. She's a weak, sniveling Baron Omega from a pathetic pack. She's got some trick in her scent, a glamour, a witch's curse. She's fooled him. No one looked convinced. They just looked afraid. I don't care what he thinks he saw, Caleb snarled, his mind racing, the first tendrils of a venomous plan beginning to form. He took a laughingstock and called her a queen. I'll prove what she really is. I'll show them all. I'll show him. He would not let this stand. He would not be the wolf who threw away a crown. He would be the one who exposed the thief who had stolen it. His reputation, his pride, his very future depended on it. He would start by reminding everyone, especially the king's court, exactly what Evie Stone had been. A few well-placed messages, a few gifts from her old life. Oh yes, he would tear her new life down, piece by piece. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. The journey was a silent, terrifying blur. Evie didn't remember walking away from the ceremonial grounds. She only remembered the sheer, overwhelming size of the king's black-gloved hand as it enclosed hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't cruel. It was absolute. A statement of ownership. She was put inside an enclosed black carriage, the likes of which she had only seen in illustrations. The interior was lined with dark, supple leather that smelled of tannins and the king's own cold scent. He sat opposite her, his massive form taking up the entire seat, his silver eyes fixed on the passing landscape, not on her. He did not speak. Not once. Evie sat perfectly still, her hands knotted in her lap, her mind a screaming void. She had been rejected. She had been claimed. She had been taken. The whiplash was so severe she felt dizzy, sick. Her pack, her attic room, the jeers, the whispers. It all seemed to belong to another life, 100 years ago. The carriage passed through a massive, shadowed archway of black stone, and the air grew colder. She was in his territory now. The Lycan lands. The very trees seemed more ancient, their branches heavier, the shadows beneath them darker. The carriage finally rolled to a stop on gravel. The door was opened by a guard in the same dark, silent armor. The king exited first, then turned, his hand offered. She stared at it, her body trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Taking his hand was not a choice. She placed her own in it, and he pulled her out, his grip effortlessly firm. She looked up, and her breath caught. It was not a pack house. It was a citadel. A fortress of black granite that clawed at the sky, a monument of power and dread. It was vast, opulent, and utterly without warmth. It was a gilded cage. She was led inside, her ragged tunic a mockery against the polished marble floors that reflected the cold, high-arched ceilings. Servants lined the hallway, dozens of them, all dressed in severe gray uniforms. They did not bow. They did not curtsy. They simply stood, their faces blank, their eyes missing nothing. Evie felt their collective gaze slide over her, cataloging her frayed hem, her dirty, calloused hands, her terrified, omega posture. A tall, severe woman with her hair in a tight silver bun stepped forward. "My king," she said, her voice as crisp as breaking ice. "This is Evelyn," the king's voice rumbled, the first words he had spoken to her since the altar. "She is to be attended. See her bathed, dressed. Give her the queen's chambers." The woman's eyebrows shot up, a barely perceptible flicker of shock, before her face smoothed back into a mask. "The queen's chambers, my lord." "Is there an echo in this hall, Alara?" he asked, his voice lethally soft. "No, my king. At once." Alara turned her cold, appraising eyes on Evie. "This way. My lady." The title was an insult, a clear statement that Evie was a pretender in a role she could not fill. Evie was led away, the king not giving her a backward glance. She was taken through endless echoing halls, up massive winding staircases. She was bathed by silent, rough-handed servants who scrubbed her skin raw, as if trying to remove the scent of her pack, of her poverty. She was put into a silk nightgown so fine it felt like water against her skin, and then she was left. Alone. She was in a room so vast it could have held her entire pack house. A fireplace, unlit, was tall enough for a man to stand in. The bed was a 4-poster monstrosity of carved black wood, draped in silver and black silks. A wall of glass looked out over a sheer 1,000-foot drop. She was a queen. She had been given greatness. And she was more isolated, more terrified, and more alone than she had ever been in her life. She backed into a corner, wrapping her arms around herself, a small, shivering creature swallowed by an opulent, crushing darkness. A sharp, formal knock echoed on the massive door. A servant's voice called through. "The king will see you. Now." Chapter 8. The Weight of the Crown. Evie was led to a dining hall that felt more like a tomb. The ceiling was lost in shadows far above, and the table, a single polished slab of black wood, could have seated 50. Tonight, it was set for 2. One at each end, a vast, echoing distance between them. King Duncan Drogo was already there, standing by the cavernous, roaring fireplace, a goblet of dark wine in his hand. The firelight caught the silver in his eyes, making them glow like embers. He wore no crown, no armor, just a simple black tunic and trousers that did nothing to hide the brutal, contained power of his body. He looked like a predator in his own den. "Sit," he commanded, not looking at her. Evie practically scurried to the far end of the table and perched on the edge of the heavy, throne-like chair. Servants materialized from the shadows, placing plates of food in front of her. Roasted meats, strange, dark vegetables, bread so fine it melted in her mouth. She stared at it, her stomach a tight, sick knot. For minutes, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant, hollow click of the king's goblet on the table. He was eating, but he was watching her. She could feel his gaze, a physical weight across the expanse of the table. "You do not eat," he stated. It wasn't a question. I am not hungry, my king," she whispered, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast room. "You will eat. You are frail. It is unbecoming. Frail, flawed, weak." The words were different, but the meaning was the same. A cold dread, sharper than her fear, settled over her. She picked up the heavy silver fork and forced a piece of meat into her mouth, chewing and swallowing without tasting. "Do you know why you are here, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on her plate. Because you claimed me." "I did." He pushed his own plate away, his meal barely touched, and steepled his fingers. "And do you know why?" She swallowed. "No, my king. You're sent." His words hung in the air. Evie looked up, confused. "My scent? But it's flawed. It's stunted. The healers said—" "The healers were ignorant pack wolves," he cut in, his voice sharp with contempt. "They are dogs sniffing at a dragon's trail. What they smell is a flaw. A Lycan smells as blood. Your scent is not stunted, girl. It is dormant." He rose from his chair, his movements fluid and silent, and began to pace the length of the hall, his presence dominating the room. Long ago, there were other Lycan lines that were thought to be extinguished in the Great Wars. Lines that were different. Your scent carries the marker, the faint, silver-laced trace of the night line, a bloodline that was rumored to walk in shadows, a line that even my ancestors feared. He stopped, turning to look at her, his silver eyes piercing the distance between them. Lesser wolves, like that arrogant beta, are repulsed by it. Their animal instincts tell them it is wrong, a threat. They fear what they do not understand. He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. Evie shrank back in her chair. He stopped beside her, looming over her. "I do not fear it," he rumbled. "I recognize it. You are a relic, a prize, a dormant power I will not allow to be wasted or thrown away." Evie's blood ran cold. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't a fated mating. She was a thing, a rare object he had collected. He hadn't saved her from her humiliation. He had merely upgraded her cage. She had traded the mockery of her pack for the cold, possessive ownership of a king. "You are in my court now," he said, his voice dropping, his proximity suffocating. "You are a symbol, my symbol, and you will learn your place. You will learn to be strong. You will learn to be worthy of the blood you carry." He leaned down, his face close to hers, his scent filling her lungs. "And you will not disappoint me. Do you understand?" She could only nod, a single, terrified jerk of her head. He had given her a crown, but she could feel its crushing, unbearable weight settling onto her brow. Chapter 9. The First Scheme. 3 days passed in a blur of opulent terror. Evie was a ghost in the black granite fortress, attended by silent servants who dressed her like a doll in exquisite dark-colored gowns she was terrified to soil. She ate her meals alone in the cavernous dining hall, as the king was occupied with matters of state. She hadn't seen him since that first, terrifying dinner. The queen's chambers were her prison. the silence broken only by the judgmental, watchful eyes of her attendants, led by the icy Alara. Evie was trying. She truly was. She walked with her head held high, though her shoulders trembled. She spoke with a quiet please and thank you, though her voice shook. She was trying to be the greatness her grandmother had promised, but she felt like a field mouse trying to impersonate a wolf. On the fourth morning, a commotion in the hall outside her chambers broke the silence. She heard Ilara's crisp voice, a male voice murmuring, and then a low collective titter of laughter from the servants. The great wooden doors opened, and Ilara entered, her face a mask of supreme malicious satisfaction. "A delivery has arrived for you, my lady," she announced. 2 footmen followed, carrying a large, rough-hewn wooden crate. It looked jarringly out of place on the fine silk carpets. It was caked with mud and smelled faintly of her old pack. "From your old home," Ilara said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Beta Caleb of the Shadow Creek pack was so thoughtful. He sent it on, believing you would not want to forget your origins. One of the footmen pried the lid off with a crowbar. Evie stepped forward, her heart pounding a sick, slow rhythm. Inside, nestled on a bed of filthy straw, were her old Omega clothes, the patched beige tunic she had worn to the ceremony, the mud-stained, threadbare leggings she wore to scrub the packhouse floors, the worn-out boots with the hole in the toe. They were all there, a collection of her shame. On top of them was a folded piece of parchment. Evie's hands trembled as she picked it up. It wasn't a private letter. It was a public message, written in a bold, arrogant hand for all to read. "To the Lady Evelyn," it began, the title clearly a mockery. "Lest you forget your humble roots in the glamour of the Lycan court, I have sent along your true finery. We all remember so fondly how you looked in them, especially the time you fell in the mud pit outside the kitchens. Such a memorable, clumsy little Omega. We, your old friends, are all so unproud to see how high you've climbed. Do not forget us." It was signed, Beta Caleb, Shadow Creek Pack. Evie stared at the words, the ink blurring through her tears. He hadn't just sent a reminder. He had sent a weapon. He had sent proof. Proof to this cold, judgmental court that she was exactly what they suspected. A fraud. A clumsy, dirty, pathetic Omega who had somehow tricked a king. She looked up, her vision clearing. Ilara was watching her, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips. The other servants in the hall were whispering, their hands over their mouths, their eyes shining with undisguised, delighted mockery. It was the ceremony altar, all over again. The laughter, the whispers, the burning, agonizing shame. Caleb had reached across the territories and put her right back in her place. She was still, and always would be, the laughingstock. Chapter 10. A Lesson in Power. The rumors spread through the citadel like poison. Evie felt the shift immediately. The servants' gazes, once cold and assessing, were now openly contemptuous. They accidentally brought her cold tea. They forgot to light the fire in her chambers, leaving her to shiver in the opulent, cavernous room. They whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, as she passed. The mud pit Omega. His Majesty's filthy little stray. She was trapped, and Caleb's invisible hand was tightening around her throat. She wanted to hide, to retreat to her rooms and never come out, but Ilara informed her, with that same malicious smile, that the king required her presence in the grand gallery that afternoon. All high-ranking members of the court would be there. It was not a request. She was dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk, her hair painfully pinned up by attendants who seemed to delight in pulling it too tight. She walked into the gallery on legs that felt like water. The massive room was filled with tables of wine and food, and dozens of Lycan nobles, all dressed in impossibly fine clothes. They were tall, powerful, and their eyes, like the king's, held an ancient, predatory light. The moment she entered, the polite chatter died. A wave of silence followed her, and then the whispers began. They were the same whispers. the beta's gift, fell in a mud pit. Evie's eyes desperately sought out the king. He was there, standing near a massive, shadowed alcove, speaking with a scarred, wolfish-looking general. He saw her enter. Their eyes met across the vast room. He watched her, his face an unreadable mask of cold granite. And then he turned back to his general. He was doing nothing. He was letting this happen. He was throwing her to the wolves. A tall, statuesque noblewoman with sharp features and diamonds glittering at her throat detached herself from a group and glided toward Evie. Her smile was all teeth. "So," the woman purred, her voice carrying in the sudden hush, "you are the acquisition." She circled Evie, just as Caleb had done, her gaze lingering on Evie's simple, unadorned gown. "I am Lady Vorna, and I must say, the king has eclectic tastes." "Lady Vorna," Evie murmured, her throat dry, her body screaming to flee. "Caleb, of the Shadow Creek pack, is a cousin of my line," Vorna said, her voice dangerously sweet. "He sent me a letter. He told me all about you. How quaint your little life was." She leaned in, her perfume cloying. "Tell me, dear, how does a laughingstock find her way to a throne? Did you simply get lucky, or was it a special skill you offered?" The insult was overt, disgusting. The nobles nearby tittered. Evie's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. She looked to Duncan again. He was still watching, his expression icy, detached. "He knows. He's testing me. He's waiting for me to fail." The thought, the cold, brutal realization that he expected her to be weak, that he wanted to see her break, ignited something new. It was a feeling she had never, ever been allowed to feel. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was a deep, blistering, cold rage. Her grandmother's words flashed in her mind. "You are destined for greatness." Evie straightened her spine. The trembling in her hands didn't stop, but she clenched them into fists at her sides. She met Lady Vorna's mocking, cruel gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, trembling, but it was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of the nightline, dormant and cold. "I may be astray, Lady Vorna," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "but at least I am not a bitch who leashes herself to the rumors of a scorned, petty beta." The gallery went utterly, profoundly silent. Lady Vorna's perfect painted smile froze, then cracked, her eyes wide with shock and fury. She had been insulted, publicly, by an Omega. Evie's heart was hammering so hard she thought it would break her ribs, but she held her ground. Across the room, she saw the king. He had not moved, but his silver eyes were no longer detached. They were fixed on her, burning with a new, terrifying, and wholly unfamiliar light. He was no longer just watching, he was seeing. Chapter 11. Grandmother's secret. Evie fled the grand gallery, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She didn't wait for a dismissal, didn't look back at the king, didn't register the stunned, furious face of Lady Vorna. She ran through the echoing blackstone halls, her emerald silk gown rustling, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She expected guards to seize her, to drag her back for her insolence. She had spoken to a high-born Lycan noble as if she were a common brawler. She had embarrassed the king. She had sealed her fate. She burst into her chambers, slamming the great wooden doors, and leaned against them, her entire body shaking. She had done it. She had ruined everything. She had proven Caleb right. She was just a pathetic common Omega with no control, no grace. She waited. For minutes. For an hour. No one came. No guards. No icy Alara. Not even the king, descending to deliver his judgment. There was only silence, thick and heavy. That evening, Alara finally appeared. Her face was impossibly stiff, her lips a thin white line. She carried not a summons to an execution, but a small, familiar, cedarwood box. "This was found among the refuse that arrived from your old pack," Ilara said, her voice clipped. "It was overlooked with the other items. His Majesty commanded it be delivered to you." She placed the box on a table and left without another word. Evie stared at it. It was her grandmother's, the last true piece of her past. Caleb's cruel gift of her old clothes had been a mockery, but this was sacred. Her hands trembled as she touched the smooth, worn wood. It was the only thing of value Catherine had owned, and she had always kept it locked. Now it was here. She lifted the lid. It wasn't locked. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single object, a silver locket, different from the simple one Evie always wore. This one was heavy, intricate, embossed with a symbol she didn't recognize, a crescent moon shielded by a willow branch. It was beautiful, but it was cold, pulsing with a faint, dormant energy that prickled her fingertips. Beneath the locket was a folded, yellowed piece of parchment. It was her grandmother's handwriting, frail but precise. "My dearest Evie," it began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am gone. But it also means you are on the path I always feared and prayed for. I have not been honest with you. My words of greatness were not just a comfort, my child. They were a prophecy. My name was not always Catherine Stone. I was born Sansa of the Vesper line, a bloodline you call the Night Line. We were not like other Lycans. We did not draw our strength from rage, but from the moon's shadow. We were a line of seers, of sensitives, of shadows. The other, more aggressive lines, like the Drogos, feared us. They called us unnatural, weak, and cold. They hunted us, and our line was thought to be extinguished. I fled, hiding my blood, my scent, my very nature, among the common pack wolves. I thought I was the last. Then I found you, an orphan whose parents were killed by rogues. But Evie, your scent, it was like mine. It was our blood, dormant but present. You are the last of our line. Your scent is a beacon. Lesser wolves like those in our pack fear it. They smell barren or flawed because it is not the scent of a simple wolf. But a true Lycan, an ancient one, will recognize it. He will hunt you. He will claim you. Do not let them see you as a prize. Do not let them see you as a relic. You are more than them. Your weakness is your power. Where they are rage, you are stillness. Where they are fire, you are the shadow. This is your destiny, my special, special girl. You are the last echo of the moon's shadow. Be brave. Be great. Evie sank to her knees, the letter clutched in her hand. Her grandmother, her entire life, a lie, a protection, a prophecy. She wasn't flawed. She wasn't broken. She was Lycan. She was Nightline. And the king. He didn't just collect her. He knew her. He knew what she was. Her outburst at Lady Vorna wasn't a common Omega's fit of pique. It was the first cold spark of her true shadowed blood. Chapter 12. The King's Regard. The next morning, Evie did not hide. When the attendants came, they found her standing by the great glass wall, dressed in the simple dark tunic she had slept in, the heavy silver locket from Catherine's box hanging securely around her neck. She was still, a new, fragile coldness in her demeanor. The terror was still there, a hum beneath her skin, but it was no longer in command. Where they are fire, you are the shadow. Ilara arrived, her face a mask of disapproval. You are to attend the king in the War Council chamber. At once, you will wear the blue silk. No, Evie said. Her voice was quiet, but for the first time in the citadel, it held no tremor. I will wear this. Ilara's eyes widened in outrage. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in Evie's stillness, in the cold, clear set of her gaze, made her stop. Ilara swallowed, her authority rattling against this new, unfamiliar obstacle. As you wish, my lady, she said, the title tasting like ash in her mouth. Evie walked to the War Council chamber alone. It was a dark, circular room, dominated by a massive stone table carved with a map of the territories. The king was at its head, flanked by the scarred general she had seen in the gallery, and a dozen other hard-faced, powerful Lycan nobles. Lady Vorna was there, her face pale and venomous, a dark bruise of humiliation in her eyes. The moment Evie entered, the room fell silent. All eyes went to her simple tunic, her unadorned hair. It was a statement. "You are late," the king rumbled, his silver eyes unreadable. "I am not," Evie replied, her voice steady. "I am here." She took an empty seat at the far end of the table, ignoring their stares. The scarred general resumed his report. "The Red Fang Pack is raiding our borders, my king. They are hit and run. We send a legion, they vanish. It is a waste of resources." "We must make an example," Lady Vorna snapped, her voice high and strained. "Send 3 legions. Burn their packlands to the ground. Show them the cost of insulting your domain." "That is foolish," the general growled. "It's what they want, to draw our strength thin, to bleed our supply lines." "Then what do you suggest, General?" Vorna sneered. "Allowing common pack wolves to bite at our heels?" The argument escalated, nobles posturing, suggesting brutal, sweeping gestures of power that solved nothing. Evie listened, her mind flashing back to her old pack, to the winters, to the way rogue bands would steal from their stores. "They are hungry," Evie said, her voice cutting through the bickering. The room went silent again. Vorna scoffed. "What did you say, Stray?" Evie met her gaze, her own locket cold against her skin. "They are hungry," she repeated, her voice clearer, stronger. "They aren't raiding for honor. They are raiding for food. It is almost winter. The Red Fang's territory is barren. I know it. They are hitting your grain storehouses, not your armories. You send legions, you send fire, and you will only make them more desperate. They will scatter, and you will have a dozen rogue bands instead of one organized pack. They will never stop." The general stared at her, his head tilted, his expression one of sharp, sudden interest. "And what?" the king asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Would you suggest, Lady Evelyn?" "Stop sending soldiers," Evie said simply. "Send grain. Send it to the border, with a clear message. Your king provides. Bend the knee. You will stop the raids, save your supplies, and gain a new, indebted pack, all without losing a single warrior." Vorna burst into laughter. "She would feed our enemies. Pathetic. This is what comes of letting pack scum." Silence. The king's voice was a flat, cold command. Vorna's laughter died in her throat, her face draining of color. King Duncan Drogo stared at Evie down the long stone table. His silver eyes were no longer detached, no longer just assessing. He was looking at her as if she were a new, complex piece on his war map. He was seeing the mind behind the Nightline blood. He turned to the general. "Do it," he commanded. "Send the grain, double the guard, and send an emissary. I want the Red Fang Alpha on his knees before me by the first snow." He rose, his gaze sweeping the stunned, silent table. He looked at Evie one last time, a long, calculating look. It was the first time he had ever looked at her with something that was not possession, not annoyance, but pure, unadulterated respect. Chapter 13. The Scent of a Queen. The king's summons came 2 days later. Not to the dining hall, not to the court, but to the Citadel's private training grounds, a vast, wind-swept courtyard paved with ancient, cracked stones. Duncan was waiting for her, stripped to the waist, his upper body a landscape of corded muscle and old, silvery scars. He was the picture of a primal warrior king. "Your performance in the council was adequate," he stated, his voice a low rumble. You have the instinct of your bloodline, a shadow's instinct, but instinct without control is a liability. Your outburst at Vorna was proof of that. You are a queen, not a brawling pup. Evie stood her ground, her arms crossed. And you are a king, not a collector. You knew what I was. You never told me. I told you all you needed to know. He countered, unfazed, that your blood was ancient. The details were irrelevant until you proved you were more than a terrified girl. He picked up 2 long wooden practice staffs. You have proven you are less terrified. Now you will prove you are more. He tossed one of the staffs at her. It was heavy, and she barely caught it. What is this? This is your education, he said. Your bloodline is not one of brawn. You will never overpower a warrior like me, or even a brute like Caleb. Your strength is in your senses, your speed, your ability to see the opening before your opponent does. You will learn to control it. You will learn to use it. The training was a new kind of hell. It was more brutal and exhausting than any chore she had ever done. He was a relentless, merciless teacher. He didn't just teach her to fight, he taught her to sense. He made her stand blindfolded and feel his approach. He made her run until her lungs burned, then spar, forcing her to find strength when she thought she had none left. Again, he would command, his voice flat, as she lay gasping on the cold stones. Get up. Weeks passed. She grew leaner, harder. The fear that had defined her was being burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. And with the exhaustion, with the proximity, something else was changing. They were sparring, the wooden staffs a blur between them. She was faster now, anticipating his moves, her shadow instinct coming alive. She ducked under a wide swing, a move he hadn't expected, and lunged, the tip of her staff striking him square in the chest. He grunted, the sound a mix of pain and surprise. Before she could react, his hand shot out and grabbed the front of her training tunic, yanking her off her feet. She was slammed against his bare, sweat-slicked chest, her face just inches from his. She was breathing his air, her senses overwhelmed by his scent. Good, he breathed, his voice a low, gravelly purr that vibrated through her. And then he inhaled. His eyes, those icy, silver orbs, widened. His control, the iron mask he always wore, cracked. Her scent was amplified by her exertion, and it was no longer dormant. It was alive. It was the scent of his mate. His grip on her tunic tightened, his knuckles white. He wasn't her king in that moment. He was just a male, primal and possessive, drowning in her scent. Evie's heart hammered, but it wasn't just fear. She could feel the raw, protective power rolling off him, a shield she had instinctively craved her entire life. It was dangerous. It was addictive. His head dipped, his lips parting slightly, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The line between king and mate was blurring, threatening to vanish in a single, ruinous instant. Chapter 14. The Unholy Alliance. Caleb smashed his ale mug against the wall of the dingy, low-ceilinged tavern room. The cheap pottery exploded, spraying stale beer over the damp stone. He was furious. His grand plan, his perfect, spiteful gift, had backfired in a way he could never have anticipated. He had just received word from his contacts on the border. That Omega, that stray, hadn't just survived his little rumor campaign. She had used it. She had publicly humiliated Lady Vorna, one of the highest-born nobles in the Lycan court. She hadn't been cowering in her room, weeping over her old, muddy clothes. She had stood up. She had fought. This was not the Evie he knew. This was not the pathetic, trembling creature he had rejected on the altar. The king was changing her. Or worse, the king had seen something that he, a beta of status, had been blind to. The mockery of, "You threw away a crown," echoed in his ears, louder and more scathing than ever. His first scheme had failed. He hadn't made her look weak. He'd made her look feisty. He'd given her a platform to show her strength, and he'd made a powerful enemy out of Lady Vorna for no gain. He needed a new plan. He needed more than just rumors. He needed an agent inside the Citadel. Someone who hated Evie as much as he did. Someone who was already seething with humiliation. He wiped his mouth, a slow, venomous smile spreading across his face. He hadn't made an enemy. He had made an ally. It took 2 weeks of careful secret messages, but he finally arranged a meeting. Not in the Lycan territories, he wasn't suicidal, but at a discreet, neutral ground inn in the foothills, a place where merchants and mercenaries mingled, and no one asked questions. He sat in a private, curtained-off alcove, waiting. She was late, a clear power play. Finally, the curtain was swept aside, and Lady Vorna entered, veiled and cloaked, her eyes scanning the room with paranoid fury. "Beta Caleb," she hissed, sliding into the booth. She was trembling with a barely suppressed rage. "You had better have a very good reason for summoning me here. If I am discovered—" "You won't be," Caleb said, his voice a smooth, confident purr. He leaned forward. "We have something in common, my lady. We have both been wronged by the same little gutter rat." "That thing publicly shamed me," Vorna spat, her hands clenching. "She insulted my line. And the king, he let her. He rewarded her for it. He took her side." "Of course he did," Caleb said, faking sympathy. "He's blinded by her scent. He thinks he's found some priceless treasure. But you and I, we know what she really is, don't we?" "She's a clumsy, ill-bred common omega," Vorna hissed. "Exactly. And my little gifts, my little reminders, they weren't enough. You need something sharper. You need a real weapon. Not just rumors, my lady, but proof." Vorna's eyes narrowed. "What proof?" "She's a fraud," Caleb lied, leaning in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Her bloodline, a sham. Her grandmother was a half-mad hedge witch. Her parents were rogue sympathizers. I have documents, letters, things that prove she is not just common. She is tainted. Proof that the king's new queen is a political and spiritual liability." He was lying, of course. He had no such things. But he could create them. And Vorna, in her blind rage, would believe anything. A slow, predatory smile spread across Vorna's face. She saw it. Her path to revenge. "And what do you get out of this, Beta?" "I get my honor back," Caleb said, his eyes glittering. "You use the proof I provide. You stage an event. You expose her, not just as a clumsy fool, but as a traitor, a spiritual sickness. The court will turn on her. The people will turn on her. And the king. A king cannot be mated to a lie." Vorna held out her pale, ringed hand. "Give me the proof, and I will give you your revenge." Caleb took her hand, his grip firm. Their unholy alliance was sealed. "You'll have it within the week," he promised. "And soon, we will attend a ball, a royal ball, and that, my lady, is where the little stray's fairy tale will come to a very messy end." Chapter 15. The Royal Ball. The announcement of the Royal Solstice Ball sent a ripple of suffocating anxiety through Evie. It was one thing to attend a war council or a small court gallery. It was another thing entirely to be presented, formally, to the alphas of the Allied territories. This was not a test. This was a judgment, on a scale she could barely comprehend. The past weeks had been a blur of relentless training. Her body was stronger, her senses sharper. Her shadow instinct was no longer a flicker. It was a low, constant hum, a cold awareness that settled in her bones. Her relationship with Duncan had changed, too. Since that moment of raw, primal connection on the training grounds, he had become even more demanding, his gaze heavier, more possessive. The king and the mate were at war within him, and his control was stretched thin. But the court remained a minefield. Lady Vorna, after her humiliation, had become eerily quiet. She was polite, She was respectful. She watched Evie with a cold, reptilian stillness that was far more terrifying than her open hostility. She was a snake, coiled and waiting. Evie knew she was planning something. The night of the ball arrived. Evie stood in her chambers, staring at the gown Alara had laid out. It was magnificent, a cascade of liquid silver silk that seemed to have been spun from moonlight itself. It was a gown fit for the Queen of the Nightline. It had clearly been chosen by Duncan. She almost didn't go. The fear was a physical, choking thing. She could hear the whispers already. She could feel the hundreds of new, assessing eyes. She was an imposter, a fraud. She clutched the heavy locket at her throat. Where they are rage, you are stillness. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of Caleb's sneering face. She thought of Vorna's triumphant, hateful smile. She would not give them the satisfaction of her failure. She put on the gown. When she was ready, she walked out of her chambers, not with the terror of a victim, but with the cold, deliberate stillness of a predator. She descended the grand staircase. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and power. Hundreds of alphas, betas, and nobles from across the continent, all gathered under the massive chandeliers. The music stopped, the chatter died, every eye turned to her. She saw Lady Vorna near the great fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand, a tight, expectant smile on her face. She was waiting for Evie to stumble, to falter. Evie kept walking. She held her head high, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of the curious, the scornful, and the calculating. She would not be their entertainment. She reached the bottom of the stairs, and the silence stretched, thick and judgmental. Then, a large, dark figure detached himself from the dais. King Duncan Drogo moved through the crowd, which parted before him like water. He wore formal black leathers, his silver-black hair tied back, his icy eyes fixed only on her. He ignored the bowing alphas, the curtsying nobles. He walked directly to her. He stopped, his gaze raking over her, a dark, possessive approval in his eyes. He said nothing. He simply, publicly, held out his arm to her. It was a silent, powerful, undeniable statement. She is mine. She is your queen. An attack on her is an attack on me. Evie looked at his offered arm, then up at his impossibly intense face. This was her king. This was her mate. And this was her destiny. She took a breath, and with a hand that was perfectly steady, she laid it on his arm. A united front was declared. Across the room, Evie saw Lady Vorna's smile tighten, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, venomous hatred. The trap, Evie knew, was about to be sprung. Chapter 16. The Second Sabotage. The ballroom was a predatory sea, and Evie was, for the first time, swimming beside the apex predator. With her hand on Duncan's arm, the whispers did not stop, but their nature changed. The mockery was stifled, replaced by a calculating, fearful curiosity. She was no longer just the mud pit Omega. She was the king's something, his queen, his pet project. No one was certain, and that uncertainty was her only shield. Duncan led her on a formal circuit of the room, his presence a suffocating wall of power. He introduced her to alphas with eyes like ancient stones and their elegantly dressed hawk-like mates. Alpha Rorik of the Stonefang Pack, my queen, Evelyn. He used the word queen deliberately, his voice a low rumble that dared anyone to question it. They bowed, they smiled, but their eyes were cold. They saw her, in her silver gown, a common, breakable thing. Evie kept her grandmother's locket clutched in her free hand, hidden in the folds of her dress, her shadow instinct screaming. The room felt wrong. There was a current of expectation beneath the music, a tension that centered on her. She saw Lady Vorna, gliding through the crowd, her face a mask of social grace, her eyes glittering. She was a serpent in silk. Vorna was talking to a group of nobles near the room's centerpiece, the altar of the First Pact, a massive ancient slab of white moon-veined marble. On it rested a sacred relic, the lyra, a ceremonial horn carved from the bone of a long-dead godwolf, used only to announce the succession of a king. It was priceless, revered, and utterly irreplaceable. The king was pulled into a deep political discussion with Alpha Rorik, his back to her for a moment. "I will return," he murmured, his gaze a warning. Evie nodded, her throat dry, and turned to accept a glass of water from a passing servant. As she turned back, a different servant, one she didn't recognize, was hurrying past her, his eyes wide and frantic. He was carrying a heavy silver tray laden with flagons of deep red blood wine. It happened in an instant. He stumbled, as if pushed from behind, and lunged forward. Evie tried to leap back, but she was too slow. The servant, with a staged cry of alarm, didn't just fall. He threw the tray. Time seemed to slow. Evie watched, horrified, as the heavy silver tray clattered against the white marble altar of the First Pact. The flagons toppled, and a tidal wave of thick, dark, staining blood wine washed over the sacred bone-white lyra. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the ballroom. The music screeched to a halt. The servant, who had landed on his knees, immediately scrambled to his feet and pointed a shaking finger directly at Evie. She tripped me. My lady, she stumbled right into my path." All eyes, hundreds of them, snapped to Evie. She stood frozen, a few dark red splashes on the hem of her silver gown, her face pale with shock. Lady Vorna's voice rang out, sharp and righteous, cutting through the stunned silence. "The sacred lyra! She has desecrated it!" Vorna swept forward, her face a mask of theatrical horror. "Oh, you poor, clumsy girl," she said, her voice dripping with malicious pity, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "This is not a muddy packhouse kitchen, dear. These are our most sacred relics." She turned to the assembled alphas. "It is just as Beta Caleb warned us. You can take the Omega out of the mud pit, but you cannot take the mud pit out of the Omega." The accusation hung in the air, perfect and poisonous. Evie was trapped. She was the clumsy common fool. She had desecrated their most holy object. She had humiliated the king. She saw Duncan, his face a mask of thunder, his silver eyes cold fire as he started to move toward her. But he was too far. She was alone, surrounded, and the entire Lycan nobility was watching her, their expressions a uniform mask of disgust and horror. This was it. This was the trap. Chapter 17. I am not your laughingstock. Evie's first instinct was to shrink, to apologize, to run. The weight of 1,000 accusing eyes, the burning, triumphant gaze of Lady Vorna, the sheer, sacrilegious stain on the white marble. It was all designed to shatter her. She could feel Caleb's spiteful, laughing presence in Vorna's words. Clumsy little Omega, flawed goods. Her hand, still hidden in her skirts, tightened on her grandmother's locket. Where they are fire, you are the shadow. Rage, cold and pure, sliced through her terror. It was the same rage she'd felt in the gallery, but this time, it was not a wild spark. It was a focused, freezing point of light. She was not that girl on the altar. She was not a victim to be prodded. She turned, not to the crowd, but to the servant, who was still trembling with false fear. She looked at him, her shadow instinct flaring. She saw his eyes dart, just for a millisecond, to Lady Vorna. She saw the wine stains on his tunic, not a splash, but a soak, as if he had deliberately doused himself to make the spill look more chaotic. She saw his boots, dry and clean, on a floor suddenly slick with wine. He hadn't stumbled. He had slid. Evie lifted her chin. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was not loud. It was cold, clear, and it cut through the horrified silence of the ballroom. He didn't stumble, she said simply. The servant's eyes widened. Lady Vorna's smile twitched. My lady, you pushed me, the servant stammered. No, Evie said, taking a step toward him. The crowd parted. You didn't stumble. You slid. Look at the floor. She pointed with a pale, steady finger. The wine is everywhere, but there is a clear, dry path from where you stumbled to where you fell. And look at your boots. The servant instinctively glanced down at his dry boots. It was a fatal, telling mistake. You poured this wine on yourself before you ever fell, Evie continued, her voice gaining strength. To make it look like a tragic accident. But you were too busy aiming for the Lyra to notice that your own path was dry. She then turned her cold gaze on Lady Vorna. And you, my lady. You were 50 feet away by the fire, yet you saw me trip him. You saw it all so clearly. Your eyesight is as remarkable as your timing. Vorna's face went pale. The theatrical horror was gone, replaced by the stark, white-hot fury of being exposed. You low-born wretch, Vorna hissed. You dare accuse— I accuse no one, Evie said, her voice ringing with a new, hard-won authority. She turned from Vorna and faced the assembled alphas, the powerful, judging nobility. Her heart was a hummingbird in her chest, but her eyes were dry. I know what you all whisper, she said, her voice shaking, but not with fear. With passion. I know what you have been told, that I am a laughingstock, a common omega, a clumsy fool from a mud pit. She took a deep breath, and her voice became a declaration. I was the laughingstock of my old pack. I was the girl who was rejected and scorned. I spent my entire life cowering. I spent my entire life believing I was worthless. She looked straight at Lady Vorna, her gaze like a shard of ice. I am done cowering. I was the laughingstock of my old pack, Lady Vorna. I will not be yours. A profound, stunned silence filled the room. Evie stood alone, trembling but unbowed, having claimed her ground. Across the room, she saw Duncan. He had stopped, his path to her clear, but he had not taken it. He was watching her, his arms crossed. The thunder was gone from his face. His silver eyes were burning, not with rage at her, but with a dark, terrifying, and unmistakable pride. Chapter 18. A Crack in the Ice. The ball ended in a flurry of stilted, formal apologies. The servant was dragged away by the king's guard, and Lady Vorna had vanished, her face a mask of pale, murderous fury. The desecrated Lyra was covered, and the crowd, their entertainment over, dispersed with a new, wary respect in their eyes for the king's chosen. Evie was escorted back to her chambers by 2 silent guards. She was exhausted, her adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow and shaking. The silver gown felt like a suit of armor she was desperate to shed. She was alone in her room for less than 10 minutes when the great doors opened without a knock. King Duncan Drogo entered. He didn't just enter. He filled the room, his dark, formal leathers making him seem even larger, his power a rolling physical presence. He dismissed her attendants with a single sharp gesture, and the doors clicked shut, leaving them in utter silence. She stood by the fireplace, her arms wrapped around her waist, watching him, her heart thudding a slow, heavy beat. She had spoken out. She had defied a noble. She didn't know if she was to be praised or punished. He prowled the room, his silver eyes fixed on her, his face unreadable. He was a caged lion, radiating a controlled, dangerous energy. You were magnificent, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her. Evie's head snapped up. What? In the ballroom, he clarified, stopping his pacing to stand in the center of the room. You were magnificent. You let it happen, she whispered, the accusation slipping out before she could stop it. You saw. You knew. You let them trap me. Yes, he admitted, without a trace of remorse. Vorna has been a thorn in my side for decades, a snake in my court. Her alliance with that beta was obvious. I wanted to see what she would do. He took a step toward her. And I wanted to see what you would do. I wanted to see if the Nightline was truly awake, or if I was mated to a mouse. His words were harsh, but his eyes were not. The icy, royal detachment was gone. In its place was a raw, burning hunger that made her skin prickle. I was tested, she said, her voice gaining a hard edge. Like an animal, like a prize you were inspecting for flaws. No, he growled, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped, looming over her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. You were tested like a blade, to see if you would bend, to see if you would break. He reached out, his hand, bare and calloused, lifting to her face. His thumb, rough and warm, traced the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to her core. You did not break, Evelyn, he whispered, his voice thick. You shattered her. He inhaled, his eyes closing for a brief second, his senses filled with her. Her scent, silver, and now the sharp, fiery spike of her anger and triumph, was overwhelming. This, he murmured, his thumb brushing her lower lip. Your strength. It is more intoxicating than your bloodline, more potent than any wine. He was no longer the king. He was Duncan, a primal male, finally uncaged, staring at the one thing he had not known he desired. He had claimed her for her blood, for her power, but he wanted her for her spirit. The line between king and mate, between control and chaos, was blurring, and his iron self-possession was cracking, threatening to shatter completely. Chapter 19. The traitor exposed. The aftermath of the ball was a cold, quiet war. Lady Vorna was confined to her chambers, for her own protection, a move that was both a punishment and a strategic delay. She was a high noble. Duncan could not simply execute her on the word of his new, unproven queen. He needed more. He needed irrefutable proof. For the first time, Evie was summoned not to the training grounds or the dining hall, but to the king's private study. It was a dark, circular room, lined floor to ceiling with ancient, leather-bound scrolls and maps. Duncan was at his desk, a massive slab of dark wood poring over a stack of intercepted messages. The servant confessed, Duncan said, not looking up as she entered. He was paid by Vorna. That is enough to censure her, but not enough to root out the rot. She conspired with Caleb. I need the proof of that alliance. I need to know its full extent. Evie walked to the desk, her newfound confidence settling around her like a cloak. She looked down at the messages. They were coded, careful. She's too smart to be caught so easily, Evie said. Vorna is a creature of the court. She lives on subtlety. She is, Duncan agreed, his silver eyes finally lifting to meet hers. There was a new dynamic between them since the ball, an unspoken partnership. But the beta is not. Caleb, he said. The name a growl, is not. No, Evie agreed, a cold spark igniting within her. He's not subtle. He's arrogant. He's driven by pride and humiliation. He's not just trying to hurt me. He's trying to fix his mistake. He's trying to prove to the world that he was right to reject me, that you were wrong to claim me. Duncan leaned back, studying her, a slow, appreciative smile touching his lips. Go on. He wouldn't just send one message, Evie said, her mind working, her shadow instinct piecing together the personality of her tormentor. He'd need to brag. He'd need to control. He'd need to know his plan was working. He'd be desperate for updates, and Vorna would be just as desperate to manage his impatience. She wouldn't risk using royal couriers. She would use a neutral third party. Someone who travels, a merchant, a mercenary, someone outside your direct control. The king's dark smile widened. He tapped a single, unassuming ledger on his desk. The trade logs. Every merchant who has entered the citadel in the last month. They worked for hours. Duncan, with his knowledge of political enemies and trade routes. Evie, with her intimate, painful understanding of Caleb's scornful, arrogant, and impatient personality. She scanned the names. "He wouldn't trust a Lycan merchant," she murmured. "Too loyal to you. He'd use a half-blood. Or a human. Someone from the borderlands, near his territory." Her finger stopped on a name. Jarek, a fur trader. His manifests show 3 visits in the last month. The first, just after the mud pit gift. The second, 3 days before the ball. He's from the Shadow Creek border. Duncan's general was summoned. Jarek the fur trader was located, persuaded to talk. And with that, the entire conspiracy unraveled. It was all there. Jarek had been the go-between, carrying messages. He'd even carried a final damning letter from Caleb, which he'd hidden in his wagon, awaiting payment. It detailed the entire plot for the ball, the plan to use the clumsy Omega narrative, and most importantly, the next phase, to use forged documents, which Caleb was creating, to prove Evie's bloodline was tainted, that her grandmother was a heretic, and that she was a spiritual and political fraud. It was a blatant, calculated, treasonous attempt to expose her, and by extension, politically cripple the king by proving his new queen was a lie. Duncan read the letter, his face hardening into a mask of pure, glacial fury. Chapter 20. The King's Justice. The next morning, the High Court was summoned. It was not a ball, nor a council. It was a judgment. The atmosphere in the Great Hall was cold and grim. The nobles stood in silence, their faces pale. Lady Vorna was brought in, flanked by 2 guards. Her arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, paper-thin bravado. Evie stood on the dais, not behind King Duncan, but beside him. She wore a simple dark blue gown, her grandmother's locket a heavy, visible weight against the fabric. She was not a petitioner. She was a partner. "Lady Vorna of the Silver Knight line," Duncan's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls. "You are brought before this court on charges of high treason." Vorna gasped, her bravado crumbling. "Treason? My king, it was a rivalry. A misunderstanding with the girl. It was a trifle, not treason." "A trifle?" Duncan rumbled, his voice dropping to a lethal low. He held up Caleb's letter, the parchment crackling in the silence. "You call a conspiracy to forge documents against the crown a trifle? You call a plot to politically destabilize the throne by proving your queen a fraud a trifle?" Vorna's eyes went wide with terror. She stared at the letter. She was caught. "You allied yourself with an external beta," Duncan continued, his voice a lash of cold fury. "You used him to spread dissent within my court. You sought to humiliate not just my mate, but my judgment. You attempted to prove my choice a lie." He stepped forward, his power rolling off him in palpable waves, forcing the entire court to flinch. "I am a tolerant king. I abide by rivalries. I allow posturing, but I do not, and will not, tolerate an attack on the crown." Vorna fell to her knees. "My king, I beg. It was the beta. He manipulated me. I was humiliated by her. She—" "Silence," Duncan commanded. He looked down at her, his silver eyes devoid of all mercy. "Your crime was not in insulting Evelyn Stone. Your crime was in believing your pride was more important than my rule. Your crime was conspiring against your king." He delivered his judgment, his voice flat and final. "You are stripped of your name. You are stripped of your lands and your titles. You will be exiled to the withered coast, your bloodline barred from this court for 1,000 years. You will leave before sundown." Vorna cries for mercy. It was all useless. She was dragged away, a wailing, broken woman. Duncan turned back to his silent, terrified court. He placed his hand over Evie's, which rested on the arm of her throne. His message was not just for Vorna. It was for every wolf in that room. It was for the entire world. "The Lady Evelyn is of the Night Line," he declared. "She is my fated, chosen queen. Her word is my word. Her honor is my honor. An attack on her," he finished, his silver eyes sweeping over them, "is an attack on me. Let there be no more misunderstandings." Evie met his gaze. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't just her protector. He wasn't just her king. He was, truly and completely, her partner. And she, in every way that mattered, was his queen. Chapter 21. Caleb's Final Gambit. The news of Lady Vorna's judgment and exile ripped through the territories like a shockwave. For Caleb, it was a death knell. He wasn't just a humiliated beta anymore. He was a named co-conspirator in an act of high treason against the Lycan king. His own alpha, terrified of the king's wrath, had publicly disavowed him. His packmates shunned him. He was an outcast, a marked man, hunted by his own kind and wanted by the crown. All his schemes, all his arrogant plotting, had turned to ash in his mouth. He was hiding in a damp, forgotten hunter's lean-to, leagues from any pack, gnawing on a tough, stringy rabbit. He was filthy, his pride was in tatters, and he was consumed by a singular, obsessive, acidic rage. It was all her fault, the weak, flawed, sniveling Omega. She had done this. She had taken his scorn and somehow, impossibly, turned it into a weapon against him. She had turned the king into her protector, her champion. He had nothing left. His status was gone. His pack was gone. His future was a cold, lonely death. And when a wolf has nothing left to lose, he becomes a different kind of animal. He becomes desperate. He couldn't fight the king's legions. He couldn't outsmart the Lycan court. But there was one last, desperate path. An ancient, primal law that predated alphas, predated packs, and predated even the modern Lycan court. A law so archaic and dangerous that no one had invoked it in 500 years. The Giora, the trial of worthiness. It was a challenge of last resort, a male wolf's right to prove a high-born female unfit for her station through a primal hunt. If he could capture her, if he could prove her weakness by subduing her, he would prove his own claim. He would prove she was not a queen, but a simple, weak Omega. It was a suicidal move. But Caleb was already dead. All he had left was his rage. He traveled for 2 days, fueled by madness and hate. He didn't sneak to the citadel. He walked, wild-eyed and feral, straight to the massive black stone gates. He was seized, of course, the guards slamming him to the gravel, their spears at his throat. "I am Caleb, formerly of the Shadow Creek Pack," he roared, his voice hoarse. "I come not as a conspirator, but as a wolf of the old law. I invoke the Giora. I challenge the king's claim on Evelyn's stone." The guards froze. This was beyond their authority. The entire citadel went silent. Within an hour, he was dragged into the great hall, bound in chains and thrown at the foot of the dais. King Duncan Drogo sat on his throne, his face a mask of glacial, murderous fury. Evie stood beside him, not in a gown, but in her dark training leathers, her expression cold and still. "You are a traitor and a fool," Duncan's voice rumbled. "You are sentenced to death." "You can't," Caleb spat, his eyes wild as he strained against his chains. "The old law protects me. I have invoked the Giora. It is my right. Or is the great Lycan king afraid? Is he afraid that his queen is nothing but a fraud? A weak, common—" Silence. Duncan's roar shook the walls. He rose from his throne, a terrifying column of power. Evie placed a calm hand on his arm. "He is right, my king," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the hall. "It is his right, and it is my right to answer it." Duncan looked at her, his silver eyes blazing. He saw no fear in her. He saw the cold, sharp steel he had helped to forge. He saw the Queen of the Nightline. He turned his gaze back to Caleb, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "You wish to invoke the old law, Beta? So be it." He made a gesture. The guards unlocked Caleb's chains. "The trial is a hunt," Duncan declared. "My ancient forest. You will have a 10-minute start. You will hunt her. But you are not just the hunter, little wolf. You are also the hunted. If she does not stop you, I will." The trial is accepted. Chapter 22. The Wolf and the Lycan. The ancient forest of the Lycan king was a place of shadows and teeth. The trees were massive, their canopies so thick they choked the moonlight, leaving the forest floor in a near-total predatory darkness. This was Evie's territory. This was the shadow. Caleb ran, his heart hammering with a mix of terror and triumph. This was his element. He was a pack wolf, a beta, a born hunter. He would find the Omega. He would track her, run her down, and snap her neck. He would prove his worth. Evie did not run. She moved. 10 minutes after Caleb, she was released at the forest's edge. She did not panic. She did not flee. She closed her eyes, her hand gripping her grandmother's locket, and let her shadow instinct take over. The cold, humming awareness of her bloodline flooded her senses. She could smell the damp earth, the decay, the fear scent of a fox a mile away. And beneath it all, she could smell Caleb's scent, a rancid, sweaty tang of arrogance, desperation, and rage. She didn't run from him. She moved with the shadows, a ghost in the trees, her leather-clad feet making no sound on the pine needles. She was not the prey. She was the trap. Caleb, meanwhile, was hunting the girl he remembered. He was tracking a clumsy, weak, flawed Omega. He moved with speed and aggression, crashing through underbrush, following the faint trail she was allowing him to find. He saw a flicker of movement, a small, dark shape, and lunged. He burst into a small, moonlit clearing and found her. She was standing there, her back to a massive, ancient oak, her breathing calm. She wasn't even sweating. "It's over, Omega," Caleb snarled, his chest heaving. He stalked toward her, a predatory grin on his face. This was it, his victory. "You were always weak. You were always—" He charged. Evie did not brace. She did not cower. She moved. At the last possible second, she used her smaller size, her newfound speed, and her shadow instinct. She dropped, spinning on her heel, and slammed her wooden training staff, the one she'd been allowed to bring, into the back of his knee. Caleb howled as his leg buckled, a sharp crack echoing in the clearing. He crashed to the ground, skidding on the damp leaves. He twisted, his face a mask of shocked fury. "Bitch!" He lunged from the ground, his claws extended, aiming for her throat. He was a beta, and even injured, he was a storm of brute force and rage. But Evie was no longer a common wolf. She was Lycan. She met his lunge not with force, but with cold, clear precision. She sidestepped, bringing her staff up, not to block, but to strike. She jammed the hardened tip into the pressure point beneath his arm, where his arm met his ribs. Caleb screamed, a sound of agony as his entire arm went numb and useless. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. This was not Evie. This was not the laughingstock. This small, still creature was a monster. She was cold. She was silent. She was hunting him. "You, what are you?" he whimpered, scrambling backward, his bravado utterly shattered. Evie advanced, her staff held low, her eyes as cold as the moon above. "I am Evelyn," she said, her voice a low, shadow-filled echo. "Of the Nightline, and you are a fool." She raised the staff to deliver the final, disabling blow. A heavy, dark shape landed between them, silent as the grave. King Duncan Drogo stood in the moonlight, his silver eyes not on Caleb, but on Evie. He had not come to save her. He had come to witness her. He looked at her, at the defeated, whimpering beta on the ground, and his face was filled with a raw, primal, absolute pride. He turned his head, his gaze finally falling on Caleb, and the temperature in the clearing dropped to freezing. The trial, the king rumbled, is over. Chapter 23. The True Mating. Caleb lay on the forest floor, a broken, whimpering wreck. He looked from Evie's cold, controlled fury to the king's glacial, possessive pride. He had lost. He hadn't just lost the trial. He had lost the entire world. He had challenged a force he could not comprehend and had been swatted aside, not even by the king, but by the flawed goods he had once thrown away. "You have lost the Giora," Duncan stated, his voice flat and devoid of mercy. "By the old law, your life is forfeit. To her." He looked at Evie, a silent, profound question in his eyes. He was giving her the right to pass judgment. It was the ultimate, final test. Evie looked down at the man who had been the catalyst for all her pain and all her growth. She saw his pathetic, terrified face, the arrogance burned out of him, leaving only a hollow shell of spite. She thought of her grandmother, destined for greatness. Greatness was not petty revenge. It was not butchering a defeated, broken foe. "Death is a release," Evie said, her voice clear in the cold night air. "He deserves to live with what he has done. He deserves to live with what he is." She turned to Duncan. "Banishment, by the old law. He is to be marked as oath-breaker and unwolfed, cast out of all territories, to live as a true rogue, shunned by all, for the rest of his days. That is my judgment." Duncan studied her, his admiration for her a palpable, warming presence in the cold clearing. She had chosen justice, not vengeance. She had chosen the wisdom of a queen. He nodded once. "So be it." He moved, his speed a blur, and pressed his claws, not to kill, but to mark, into Caleb's shoulder, searing the flesh with the glowing, permanent, magical sigil of the banished. Caleb screamed, a sound that was less than animal, less than human. "Go," Duncan commanded. "And if you are ever seen on Lycan or Packlands again, I will not be so merciful." Caleb scrambled to his feet, clutching his ruined arm, his leg dragging, and fled into the darkness, his sobs the only sound. The forest was silent. Evie stood, her staff still in her hand, her body vibrating with adrenaline. Duncan turned to her. The king was gone. The alpha of alphas was gone. All that remained was the male. He walked toward her, his silver eyes blazing with a potent, undeniable mixture of awe, pride, and raw, primal desire. "You, Evelyn," he breathed, his voice thick. "You are everything." He stopped in front of her. He didn't just look at her. He revered her. He saw not a prize, not a relic, not a student, but his equal, his true, fated, and proven partner. "You are my queen," he whispered, his large, calloused hand coming up to cup her face, his touch reverent. In blood, in spirit, and in truth. Evie's heart, which had been a cold stone of focus, suddenly burst into a wild, soaring warmth. This was it. This was the moment her grandmother had promised. This was not a claim of possession. This was a partnership of souls. She dropped the staff. It clattered on the stones. She raised her hands and, for the first time, she initiated the contact. She placed her palms on his broad, powerful chest, feeling the wild thrum of his heart beneath her hands. "And you," she whispered, her voice shaking, but with emotion, not fear, "are my king." He didn't hesitate. His control, held iron tight for so long, finally shattered. He crushed her to him, his mouth descending on hers in a kiss that was not gentle, not tentative, but a devastating, primal, and absolute claiming. It was the taste of winter and forever. It was the sealing of their bond, a true mating of two apex predators, a king of power and a queen of shadows, finally, completely, united as one. Chapter 24. The Queen of Greatness. 6 moons later, the Great Hall of the Lycan Citadel was unrecognizable. It was still a place of black granite and high, shadowed arches, but it was no longer cold. Warm, bright tapestries depicting the history of both the Drogo line and the Forgotten Night line hung on the walls. Braziers burned warmly, and the court, though still respectful, was no longer frozen in terror. It was a court ruled by 2, and it was thriving. Queen Evelyn sat on her throne, a chair of dark wood and silver inlay beside Duncan. She was not the girl in the beige tunic, nor the trembling woman in the silver gown. She was a sovereign. Her hair was bound in intricate braids, and she wore a deep, night blue gown, her grandmother's locket resting over her heart as a symbol of her line. She listened intently as a border alpha gave his report, her insights sharp, her questions astute. The court no longer saw her as a stray. They saw her as the shadow hand, the wise, calm counterpoint to the king's primal power. The general concluded the morning's reports. "One final matter, my queen, my king. A delegation has arrived from the Crescent Moon Pack." Evie's spine went rigid. Duncan's hand, resting on the arm of his throne, clenched, his silver eyes turning to hers, a silent question. "Let them enter," Evie said, her voice perfectly level. Alpha Marcus, the leader of her old pack, stumbled into the hall. He was no longer the proud, booming alpha. He was gaunt, his furs ragged, his eyes hollowed by desperation. He was followed by a few pack elders, including Maris, the head Omega who had once terrorized Evie. They all looked starved, broken. They fell to their knees at the foot of the dais, their foreheads touching the cold stone. "My queen," Alpha Marcus cried, his voice breaking. "Forgive us. We did not know." "Rise, Alpha Marcus," Evie said, her voice not cold, but not warm. It was the voice of a monarch. "State your purpose." "The winter," he choked out. It was brutal. The Blighted River Pack. They raided our stores. We are starving, my queen. Our pups are dying. We have nowhere else to turn. We throw ourselves on your mercy. Please." Maris was weeping, her face streaked with dirt. "We are so sorry, Evelyn. My queen, we were blind. We were fools. Please help us." The hall was silent. Evie looked at the people who had made her life a living hell, the people who had called her flawed and laughingstock. She had the power to let them starve. She had the power to turn them away, to give them the same cold shoulder they had given her for 2 decades. She felt Duncan's gaze on her. He would support any decision she made. This was her past, her judgment. She looked down at Alpha Marcus, at the cowering, weeping pack who had scorned her. And she did not feel rage. She did not feel triumph. She felt pity and the heavy, undeniable weight of her station. "You are destined for greatness," her grandmother's voice echoed in her heart. Greatness was not revenge. Greatness was strength. It was mercy. It was rising above. She turned and met her king's gaze. He saw the decision in her eyes before she spoke, and his answering smile was one of profound, absolute love. He nodded. Evie turned back to her former pack. She rose from her throne, a figure of dark, quiet, absolute authority. "You were blind," she declared, her voice ringing with the power of a queen. "And you were cruel. You allowed your pack to be ruled by scorn and prejudice. That is not the Lycan way. That is not my way." Alpha Marcus flinched, awaiting his doom. "But my king and I do not let children starve," she continued. "You will have aid. Grain, supplies, and medicine will be sent. My general will secure your territory." She descended the steps of the dais, walking until she stood directly before her old, kneeling Alpha. She looked down at him, not as Evie the Omega, but as Evelyn the Queen. "But I will be the one to oversee it," she stated. "I will be coming to the Crescent Moon Pack, and you will show me your ledgers. You will show me your nurseries.
And you will learn, Alpha Marcus, what true, worthy leadership looks like. She stood before them, the living, breathing fulfillment of her grandmother's promise. She was not the laughingstock. She was not the rejected. She was the queen. And her greatness had just begun.